Previously on Critical Nobody. I would disagree with that assessment since, in my opinion, a Resident Evil 2 remake without the scenario stuff would be like remaking Resident Evil 3 without the Nemesis choices, without the Nemesis choices, without the Nemesis choices,
without the Nemesis choices? Disappointed!
Breaking news, everyone! The guy who made a critical video about the Resident Evil 2 remake also has an opinion on the Resident Evil 3 remake. Yeah, I know, the sky is blue, water is wet, and Pot of Greed allows you to draw 2 cards from your deck. No one is shocked to hear this, but this time my mindset going into the latest RE was quite different. When I gave my somewhat contentious take on RE2 last year, it came from a place of fanboy love and appreciation for the PS1 classic, having played it countless times. While I thought the remake was great on its own merits, I decided to focus on aspects I thought were lesser than the original, and my reason for doing so was the general lack of critique I saw from many other channels. I'm not saying there wasn't any, YouTube is a big platform, but all the voices I generally listened to were declaring it Game of the Year and an objective improvement across the board, a sentiment I disagreed with. I caught some flack for my opinions, but I'd rather speak my mind and get some pushback than join a chorus of praise I don't totally agree with. But when it comes to my thoughts on the new RE3, the situation is almost exactly the opposite of what I just described. Since I didn't play the original when it first released in 1999, I don't really have the nostalgia for it. I did eventually play the game a handful of years later when it was ported to the GameCube. I liked it fine, but by that point I had already experienced the masterpiece that was Resident Evil 4, so it lacked a certain level of impact, and I never had much desire to revisit it. In addition to that, the hype and applause I found myself somewhat opposing when it came to RE2 isn't really a thing here. With the exception of maybe IGN, the consensus on Jill Valentine's return has been a collective shrug, and that about sums up my feelings too. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to bother making this video because I highly doubt I'll be adding anything new to the conversation. However, I've gotten enough requests from people the last few weeks asking for my opinion that I've decided to put my reservations to the side and share. Before I jumped into the remake, I decided to do my homework by replaying the original twice so it was fresh in my mind for comparison, and let me tell you, doing so takes the already present issues with this new interpretation and amplifies them tenfold. This remake takes almost every unique aspect of the '99 game, all the mechanics that made it stand out, and throws them out the window. But before we go any further, it's only fair I give a spoiler warning, as I'll be talking about both versions of Resident Evil 3 freely from here on out. You're always welcome to come back later if you want to play either game for yourself first. Time to be underwhelmed. For whatever reason, these updated takes on classic Resident Evil seem dead set on taking away core aspects of what made each entry unique, the things that gave them their identity. Some will shout me down declaring I just don't like change, but that's not the issue. I understand remakes need to alter stuff. If nothing is changed, then the remake is superfluous and has no reason to exist. But when your idea of change is to take away from the experience by removing content and failing to replace it with anything of substance, you're inherently making a weaker product. The reason why the remake of Resi 1 is so cherished by fans of all types is because it's a perfect blending of old and new. It applies a fresh coat of paint and adds elements to shake things up without compromising the original's DNA. Then came the RE2 remake, which, while generally a great modernization, removed the most defining feature the PS1 game brought to the table, that being the zapping system, aka the AB scenarios. Yeah, you could argue they technically included them with the second run stuff, but those were half-assed retreads of the same exact story content you already played. So now, let's go over every element that made Resident Evil 3 stand out from its predecessors, cause there's quite a few, and compare it to what we got in 2020. Perhaps the most prominent feature of old-school RE3 were the live selection choices that frequently popped up during your playthrough. Usually, but not exclusively appearing when the hulking nemesis showed up, time would slow down and you'd be given a few precious seconds to select one of 2 options. This gave the player a sense of agency in each situation, and depending on the path taken, you'd potentially see a unique location, obtain a unique item, or alter how following sequences played out. You could delay your pursuer before he started chasing you around, or prevent it from happening at all. You could enter the same area from two completely opposite ends. You could even alter a prominent character's fate and see one of two different endings. But that element of choice wasn't only present in these binary selections. While you were required to visit all the same primary locations every run, you always go to the restaurant, you always go to the gas station, the order you visited these places would change what story scenes you encountered. Jill can meet Carlos in two different places, minor characters can die in two different ways, and Nemesis can appear in a few different locations. Sure, he'll always pop up for the same scripted story beats, but there are parts of the city he can pester you in one playthrough that are entirely safe in another. All of this gave RE3 a high degree of built-in replayability, keeping the experience fresh for multiple playthroughs as you work to see all the varied outcomes of your decisions. The remake drops all of that. Jill's struggle to survive the fall of Raccoon City is now completely linear. Characters are introduced at the same points, every Nemesis encounter is a scripted set piece, and locations are visited in a set order. You'll see the same stuff on your second or third playthrough that you saw on your first. Now, don't take this as a condemnation of linearity as a whole, because it's not. There are plenty of kick-ass experiences that more or less take place on rails. But since this game here is declaring itself to be Resident Evil 3, when a game with that title already exists that offers player choice and branching paths, it's a glaring omission that can't help but make this latest effort seem lazy, or at least misguided. The original continued to mix things up each run by randomizing a number of variables whenever you started a new game. Most of these changes were small, with environment layouts and key item locations remaining static, but they were certainly noticeable to returning players. A room that contained gunpowder might now have healing herbs instead. A dice roll determined whether you got the grenade launcher or Magnum early on. A horde of zombies you had to deal with in a certain area might be replaced by a pack of Cerberus dogs or a murder of crows. And certain puzzles could be tweaked to have a handful of different solutions. I won't go as far as to call these switcheroos game-changing, but they definitely kept you on your toes, and when combined with the already discussed choices, they helped keep things interesting. Well, forget about all that, because these neat little mix-ups aren't in the remake either. Every bullet, herb, and weapon is set in its proper place, every enemy will appear when it is meant to, and every puzzle will always have the same solution. Now, before some of you start typing away to correct me, yes, higher difficulties like Nightmare do move things around a bit by introducing stronger baddies earlier on and altering item spawns. However, I can't say these adjustments did anything to really change my experience, mostly because by this point it was my third playthrough, and I had unlocked the infinite rocket launcher. Kinda trivialized things a bit. But while Nightmare and Inferno make an effort to shuffle a couple things around, they're not random, they're just unique placements to those set difficulties. Every Nightmare run will be the same as every other Nightmare run. This is not comparable to what was offered in 1999, and is yet another missing element from the remake. Of course, we've got to talk about the big bad boy himself, Nemesis, the unstoppable tyrant tasked with hunting down every member of STARS still in the city. A creature so integral to RE3 that they put his name as the subtitle. On PS1, he had this sort of looming presence over the entire game. His introduction is dispatching teammate Brad Vickers with minimal effort, which I doubt anyone shed a tear over, cause this is the same Brad that left Jill and friends stranded in the Arklay Mountains. But from then on, you're always on edge wondering when this beast will show up, especially since he can be in different places depending on your actions. There are the big dramatic entrances you'd expect an antagonist like him to have, but sometimes he's just stalking an area. He'll appear at unexpected times to chase you around, and while the iconic loading doors give you some temporary breathing room, there are numerous instances where he'll follow you through them the moment the camera cuts to a different angle. God help you whenever you're backed into a corner and forced to fight. He's not an easy opponent to deal with, tanking a high degree of damage and punishing mistakes by tossing Jill around like the feeble bag of flesh and bone she is. Whenever he appears, you kinda have the same reaction as Jill, that being, oh crap, how do I deal with this? In the remake, they try really, really hard to make Nemesis seem intimidating, but it comes across as artificial. Because of the new linear focus, he will always show up at the same places and his appearances quickly become predictable. The only time I was surprised by him doing his Kool-Aid Man routine was right at the start because I was expecting more build-up. For the majority of the game, he's nothing more than a set-piece machine, a tool inserted to start some kind of over-the-top action sequence, one you generally don't get much control over. Instead of avoiding him yourself, the game will routinely rip you out of gameplay and have Jill react to his assault on her own, and even when you are given control, you're generally just running in a straight line until the next cutscene. Nemesis comes off as a largely incompetent nuisance most of the time. In the OG game, Jill kept besting him, sure, but he felt like an obstacle she was barely scraping past thanks to her experience and quick thinking. But here, there are so many times where he has her dead to rights. He's caught her by surprise, has her literally by the neck, there's nothing stopping him from ending her right there, but instead he dicks around because she's our protagonist and needs to escape. If that happens once, you can let it go as a close call for dramatic effect. When it happens repeatedly, it eliminates any threat you're trying to establish. There is one brief section early on that has Nemesis stalking you through the downtown area, but this part seems like an afterthought, being as brief as it is underwhelming. He can be a pain to avoid at first if you're just trying to run, with attacks that can stunlock or knock you into a waiting zombie, but then you realize he goes down with one single grenade, and the menace evaporates. Even if Nemesis was handled better across the board, Mr. X did the same thing more competently in RE2, so the impact and uniqueness of being pursued by an uber-powerful threat is no longer something RE3 can claim as its own. I don't think anyone will deny that RE3 had a heavier action focus than what came before it. Big packs of undead are thrown at you often, Raccoon City is shown to be the #1 distributor of explosive barrels in the country, and there's more than one scene of Jill or Carlos running away from something blowing up in grand fashion. The game was still built around the familiar Resident Evil framework, but it was the first example of the series leaning away from survival horror and more towards spectacle. But there was one important aspect that RE3 had that made that shift work: restraint. Whether it was a conscious decision or simply a result of hardware limitations, the big crazy set pieces were broken up by the usual exploration and item collection downtime. The pace was amped up, sure, but everything was still given enough time to breathe. You need those peaks and valleys, because if the majority of your experience is set to 11, all of those explosive events blend into each other and become mundane. The further I got into the RE3 remake, the more a certain realization began to dawn on me. I wasn't playing Resident Evil 3. I was playing Michael Bay Presents Resident Evil 3. There's downtime, yeah, but the number of pedal to the metal, everything is blowing up around you scenes feels greatly increased. The pacing of this game can be summed up as someone looking at the original and hitting fast forward. You don't have to go any further than the intro to see that. Game starts and, oh shit, Nemesis! Here's Nemesis again. Hey, look, here he is for third and fourth time. Hey, look, it's Brad! Okay, bye, Brad. Keep running. Ah, spooky! Hey, look, a helicopter! Oh, that exploded. Nemesis is back! OMG, car crash. Hello, Carlos, fancy seeing you here. Ed, we're at the subway car. Compare this to the original, where similar events are spaced out over the course of 90 minutes, give or take, on a first playthrough. Like, holy shit, remake, slow your roll. All the boom-happy set pieces that get thrown at you provide decent visual spectacle, but their frequency weakens any intensity they're supposed to have. The need to put Jill in constant crazy escape scenes doesn't make Nemesis scary. Like I said earlier, it does the exact opposite. Conversely, Jill is portrayed as a Terminator that is basically immune to anything this ultimate killing machine throws at her. She gets grabbed, tossed around, she even gets a rocket shot directly at her feet and comes out of it mildly annoyed. On top of that, her movement speed during gameplay of a leisurely jog makes these chases comical. She's not running for her life, she's a few minutes late for her waitressing job at Denny's. When your hero or heroine repeatedly brushes off stuff back to back that would obliterate an elephant, we have no reason to be concerned for their safety, which translates into a total lack of tension. RE3 introduced gunpowder, letting you mix and match 3 different types to make your desired ammunition. Do you use what you have now to make some reliable handgun bullets, or conserve your resources for the reward of making some grenade launcher or magnum rounds later? Deciding what ammo to make and when gave players further control over the experience. This mechanic is one of the few things new RE3 didn't remove, though it is streamlined by getting rid of the reloading tool that took up an inventory slot in the original. I don't really have any complaints about it, but once again, this system is no longer unique to RE3. Gunpowder was also present in RE2, so it's simply a holdover mechanic from last year. The third Resident Evil installment upgraded Jill by giving her a dodge maneuver. By hitting a button right before an enemy attack landed, you could perform a sidestep or roll to avoid the danger. It was a cool idea, but it wasn't implemented great due to how strict the timing was and how this ability was mapped to the controller. Dodging was on the same button that readied your weapon, and if you were aiming, it was changed to the fire button. Dedicated fans and speedrunners almost certainly have this move mastered, but I'd say 95% of the dodges I performed during my 2 playthroughs were accidental, unintentional results of this awkward design. The dodge is present in the remake and is an overall improvement, though it does take some time to figure out. Having the sidestep be its own separate function is undeniably better from the get-go, but if you try to dash past or through zombies like I did at first, it doesn't work. The lack of invisibility frames means you're going to be sucked into a grab. But if you sidestep at the right moment, you'll perform a perfect dodge that safely evades the attack and gives you the option to enter a slow-motion state to retaliate. The problem is that, as far as I can tell, and if I'm mistaken, please correct me, you're never told about perfect dodging anywhere in-game, so it's something you have to accidentally discover on your own. Still, this is one mechanic I can say remains unique to this pair of entries and is one of the few things the remake does better than what came before. This series is known for stuffing their games with cool bonus content, and OG Resident Evil 3 was the entry to introduce Mercenaries. Unlocked after beating the campaign, Mercenaries is a time trial mode that tasks you with rushing through sections of Raccoon City as a timer ticks down, with precious extra seconds rewarded for killing monsters and rescuing survivors. There are 3 playable characters, each with their own loadout, and successfully completing runs gives you in-game cash that could be spent on unlockables for the main game. This mode has never been for me personally, it's just not what I go to these games for, but it was such a popular extra that it would go on to be included in multiple Resident Evil entries going forward. Now let's compare that to my footage of Mercenaries from the remake. Yeah, this was cut too. Unlockables like infinite ammo weapons and stat buffing coins are now bought using points earned by completing challenges during normal play, and you can get most of this balance-shattering stuff pretty quick. As long as you save in the proper places, you can farm weapon and overall kills with ease, and before long you'll have all the tools you need to breeze through the campaign in record time. I won't deny that it's fun to break the game after only 2 playthroughs, but I don't see any reason why a cherished edition like Mercenaries had to go. Okay, this is a separate topic since Resident Evil 3 didn't have any sort of multiplayer, and technically still doesn't. Many have argued the relatively short and shallow nature of the remake doesn't justify it being sold at full price, but Capcom tried to add value by including Resident Evil Resistance. No, it doesn't actually have anything to do with RE3, in fact it's an entirely separate game, but since the only way to get access to it is to purchase the remake, I'm going to consider it part of the package. So, does this competitive take on Resident Evil justify that $60 price tag? No, it does not. The premise is kinda cool at least. 4 survivors fight through various testing grounds trying to reach an exit before the timer ticks down to 0. Meanwhile, one other player, dubbed the Mastermind, spawns in traps and monsters using scattered security cameras in an effort to slow them down. A selection of survivors with different strengths and skills to mix up team configurations, and the 4 available Masterminds, each of whom have unique foes and abilities to call their own, are meant to add variety to each match. I only spent a few hours with the multiplayer, and while its hodgepodge of interesting ideas can provide an occasional spark of enjoyment here and there, most of my time was spent shifting between total boredom and frustration. The basic gameplay and controls of the recent RE games work great in a controlled single-player context, but when thrust into a frantic PvP setting, they become a clunky mess. Jogging in circles at a relaxed pace looking for keys while fighting off undead with melee and firearms that feel about as deadly as a pillow fight does not make for compelling multiplayer. The Mastermind doesn't fare much better, as they either pepper the map with monsters that do little to impede, or just spam hordes whenever the survivors congregate in one room, maybe taking control of something every once in a while to feel like a more active participant. The only real fun I had was during the few times I was able to unleash and control a mutated Birkin. He controlled like a freight truck, but there was a simple satisfaction in trapping someone in a corner and beating the ever-living shit out of them. The more you play with a certain character, the more they rank up, and the higher their rank, the more stat-altering equipment they can have on at once. How do you get these buffs? Loot boxes, of course. Using credits earned after each match, you can unlock loot boxes for either gameplay-affecting items or cosmetics. The price of the cosmetic box is hilariously inflated and stuffed with all kinds of useless emotes and sprays that I've never seen anyone use to pad out the time between the skins people actually want. The equipment boxes come in 3 different tiers, the higher of which you can't use until you rank up, meaning high-level players have access to better potential gear. Fun. Now, you can't buy these loot boxes with real money directly. The only currency that opens them is what's earned in-game. But you can buy boosters that double how much of that currency you earn. Make sure to buy the 50-pack for $29.99, it is the best value after all. Of course, this pay-to-win trash translates to all kinds of imbalance. Add to that a small player base, and you'll almost always find yourself in completely lopsided matches, where a low-rank mastermind is put up against a gang of beefed-up survivors that steamroll everything, speedrunning the maps they've undoubtedly memorized. In fact, in my 3 or so hours with the game, I've never seen the mastermind come anywhere close to winning. Actually, that's not true. I did see them win once, but that was because the match dropped, so I don't think that counts. Resistance isn't good. It's one of those games that puts you into a disinterested trance, blankly staring at your monitor, completely unengaged in the goings-on, and when you stop playing, you struggle to remember what you were just doing. The fact that this was put behind any kind of paywall, let alone thrown in with RE3 as some kind of enticement, is pretty tone-deaf. Even divorced from that as a separate free-to-play thing, which I bet it will become sometime later this year, it's not really worth talking about. Here are just a few extra thoughts I had. Changing the substation to a lair of bug creatures that forcibly hentai Jill seems like needless shock value and made my pee-pee feel weird. Some random lines of dialogue have really poor lip syncing.
They'll call off the strike if, and this is one big-ass if, we can deliver the vaccine to them.
Carlos has stupid hair. Does every Resident Evil villain have to be so obviously evil?
No, wait, please!
On that note, having Nikolai be the final climactic encounter only serves to make Nemesis seem even more inconsequential. I know the dodge is supposed to substitute for sub-weapons, but being unable to escape a grab once it's started kinda sucks. I like that we get to see how Marvin is bitten, and it was fitting that Brad was the one to inflict the injury. The handful of QTEs that appear at random seem thrown in, are basically impossible to fail, and add nothing. The boss fights continue to not be fun. And the clock tower, park, and factory levels from the original are all gone, but I did like how more context was given for Carlos fighting the antidote in the hospital, and having the game conclude in a secret lab rather than some random factory feels more thematically appropriate. If you look at Resident Evil 3 on its own, completely divorced from its PS1 counterpart, the game is alright. It's not like an RE6 abomination or anything. You'll have a decent time, but in the end, you're left playing a weaker, more shallow version of what we got last year that doesn't leave a whole lot of impact. However, when the inevitable comparisons are made to the classic that came before it, the remake is exposed as a hollow shell of its former self, a husk that abandons almost every ambitious, standout idea of its namesake. I don't know if this game was rushed out the door to capitalize on the general love for Resident Evil 2, or if we got exactly what the developers envisioned from day one, but either way, Resident Evil 3 is a sizable letdown and an underwhelming remake. While I was working on this video, it was more or less confirmed that a remake of Resident Evil 4 was in development, the one game in the series no one asked to be remade. That game is still incredible. It's just as great today as it was 15 years ago, and I don't see how you could possibly capture that lightning in a bottle again, or at least do so up to the same standard. Given what we've seen from these recent remakes, a new RE4 will probably rip out the merchant, cut out the castle chapters, and replace all the cheesy dialogue with Leon saying fuck. But hey, maybe, just maybe, the tepid response and overall criticism to RE3 will teach Capcom to respect where it came from, and not needlessly change or throw out everything that made that game what it was. But I'm not going to hold my breath. Thanks for listening to my thoughts on the Resident Evil 3 remake. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please share your thoughts on the remake and the original down below in the comments. Let me know if you agree or disagree. And if you liked the video, please be sure to leave a rating down below and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more from me in the future.